The house didn't scream when the verdict was read. It exhaled, a soundless collapse of certainty, of legacy, of everything people thought they knew about a family that once represented the clean, untouchable glow of Hollywood royalty. And in that suffocating silence, one woman fell to the floor. Not metaphorically, not emotionally, physically. She collapsed. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Cameras caught it. Court sketches froze it in graphite. Witnesses later described the moment with the same word, over and over again, unthinkable. Because this wasn't supposed to happen. Not to her. Not to them. Not to a family whose name had been synonymous with laughter, success, and moral clarity for decades. So let me ask you something, right now, before we go any further. How does a family go from red carpets to crime scene tape? From awards speeches to courtroom whispers? And how does a sister become the most dangerous unanswered question in a case that already defied belief? That question is where this story begins. Not with blood, not with the arrest, but with the illusion. For years, the Reiner family, Hollywood insiders called them that half-jokingly, were considered untouchable. Patriarch Victor Reiner Wood, a legendary filmmaker in his late 70s. His wife Elaine, a philanthropist known for her quiet generosity and razor-sharp intellect. Their estate in Brentwood wasn't just a home. It was a symbol. High gates, old trees, a driveway that curved like it was designed to keep secrets. Inside those walls, birthdays were celebrated with laughter that echoed down marble halls. Careers were launched over kitchen table conversations. Family dinners felt scripted in the best possible way, warm, witty, effortless. Or at least, that's how it looked. Because what no one saw, what no one wanted to see, was how fragile the entire structure really was. And standing at the center of it all was Tracy. Tracy Reiner had spent her entire life walking a narrow line between visibility and invisibility. Oldest daughter. Not the loudest. Not the wildest. Not the one tabloids chased. She was the composed one. The reasonable one. The fixer. Every family has one. The person who smooths over arguments. Who explains away awkward moments. Who steps in when things get uncomfortable and says, "Let me handle it." That was Tracy's role. And she played it well. Too well, some would later say. She lived nearby, but not inside the main house. Close enough to be present. Far enough to maintain independence. Friends described her as loyal to a fault. Devoted to her parents. Protective of her siblings in a way that bordered on obsessive. Especially when it came to Nick. Nick Reiner was the youngest. 32 years old. Charismatic in flashes. Troubled in stretches. The kind of person who could be magnetic one moment and unreachable the next. He lived in the guest house behind the main estate. A detail that seemed trivial at the time. Convenient. Practical. In hindsight, it would haunt everyone. Because when police arrived at the estate on that quiet Sunday night, it wasn't a break-in they found. It was a massacre. Victor and Elaine were discovered in their bedroom. Stab wounds. Multiple. Brutal. No sign of forced entry. No robbery. Nothing missing. Just violence. Raw. Personal. Furious. And here's where the story takes its first sharp turn. Authorities didn't spend weeks hunting a suspect. They didn't issue public pleas. They didn't search the city. Nick was arrested that same night. Let that sink in. The sun. The guest house. The proximity. Within hours, the narrative shifted from tragedy to horror. But even then, even as headlines screamed and commentators speculated, there was one person no one was looking at. Tracy. Not because she was invisible, but because she was everywhere. She was the one who made the calls. The one who spoke to lawyers before the sun came up. The one who coordinated family statements, funeral arrangements, and media silence with eerie efficiency. Grief does strange things to people. It sharpens some, breaks others. Tracy sharpened, and that raised a quiet question among investigators. One that didn't make the news at first. Why was she so prepared? Before you answer that, let me introduce the final piece of the puzzle. Romy, the youngest daughter, 27 years old, largely removed from the family business. More private, more fragile, according to friends. She was the one who found the bodies. Imagine that moment. Driving up to your parents' house, expecting normalcy, routine, maybe an argument about nothing important. And instead, silence. A silence so wrong it feels loud. Romy later told police something that would ripple through the investigation like a shockwave. She warned them. She said there was a dangerous family member, someone who should be a suspect. She didn't name them publicly, but privately, that name landed like a bomb. Now pause here. Ask yourself this. Why would a daughter point inward? Why would she fracture the family narrative at the exact moment unity mattered most? Because Romy had seen something. Something she hadn't understood at the time. Something that, in retrospect, terrified her. And that brings us to the trial. Nick's case moved fast. Too fast, some said. Evidence stacked up. Prosecution painted a picture of rage, entitlement, and a lifetime of unresolved conflict. Defense argued mental instability, emotional fractures, a family that failed its own. But here's the part no one expected. Halfway through the proceedings, the focus shifted. Subtly at first, then all at once. Text messages surfaced. Financial transfers. Late-night calls between siblings that no one could explain. And suddenly, Tracy's name wasn't just being mentioned. It was being questioned. Was she covering for her brother? Guiding him? Or something far more dangerous? The prosecution never said it outright at first. They didn't have to. They let the jury connect the dots. A meeting here. A deleted message there. Contradictions in her testimony that didn't match timelines or phone records. The composed sister began to crack, and the public watched in disbelief. Because this wasn't a story about a single crime anymore. It was a story about loyalty turned lethal. About family bonds stretched so tight they snapped. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom was packed. Not with celebrities. With cameras. With tension so thick it felt electric. Nick was found guilty. 2 counts. First-degree murder. A gasp moved through the room like a wave. But then the judge continued. Additional findings. Conspiracy. Complicity. And Tracy's world imploded. She collapsed as the words accomplice and consequences echoed through the courtroom. Not alleged. Not suspected. Declared. People argue to this day whether that collapse was shock, guilt, or something else entirely. But here's what no one can deny. That moment changed everything. Because if Tracy wasn't just a bystander, if she wasn't just cleaning up after chaos, then the story we thought we understood was a lie from the beginning. And the question becomes even darker. What did she know? When did she know it? And why didn't anyone see it sooner? Back before the murders, before the guest house, before the warning, to the early cracks in a perfect family facade and the warning signs everyone ignored. A seemingly ordinary family photo taken one summer afternoon in the sprawling gardens of the Reiner Wood estate. The sun filters through towering oaks, casting long shadows across manicured lawns. Victor Reinerwood sits in a wicker chair, his posture relaxed, the kind of confidence only decades in Hollywood can buy. Elaine leans slightly forward, her hand resting gently on his knee, a smile that seems to promise warmth and stability. Tracy stands behind them, her eyes alert but calm, while Romy, barely 20, clutches a small dog and smiles with tentative enthusiasm. And Nick? Leaning casually against the hedge, jacket slung over one shoulder, he looks like the charming younger brother everyone loves, the one who might one day surpass his parents in fame, talent, or notoriety. On the surface, this image is everything the world expects from the Reinerwood family. Beauty, charisma, cohesion. A dynasty untouched by scandal, perfect in its symmetry. But photographs are deceiving. Beneath the smiles, fissures already run deep. It wasn't visible in that sunlit moment, but cracks had been forming for years. Small disagreements over inheritance. Tensions around career expectations. Late-night arguments that neighbors occasionally heard but dismissed as typical family bickering. Everyone has disagreements, right? But in the Reinerwood household, the disagreements were rarely benign. They were storms disguised as whispers. Tracy's role in this delicate ecosystem was crucial. She was the quiet glue, the mediator, the one who kept emotional explosions contained. Friends marveled at her composure, noting how she could transform a potential disaster into a calm negotiation. She always knew what to say, one family friend would later remark. She could make a fight disappear, make people forget the anger, the resentment. Like magic, or like manipulation. Manipulation. That word, gentle at first, would grow heavier as events unfolded. Tracy's position was both enviable and dangerous. She had access to every private conversation, every financial detail, every argument that might hint at deeper trouble. She could step in, redirect, or even conceal. It was a position that demanded loyalty and discretion, and she had both. To a fault. Nick, on the other hand, was the opposite. Impulsive, charming, unpredictable. He could be magnetic, drawing people into his orbit, yet vanish emotionally when things became uncomfortable. His relationships, both romantic and professional, were peppered with inconsistency, often leaving others frustrated or concerned. While Tracy acted as the stabilizer, Nick was the storm. Romy, youngest and seemingly untouched by the family's complex hierarchy, played observer. She recorded the events around her silently, internalizing them without the same filtering mechanisms that Tracy employed. She watched the tensions, the subtle manipulations, and the moments where family loyalty shifted dangerously between individuals. The estate itself mirrored this dynamic. The main house, grand and imposing, was a fortress of tradition, representing authority and control. The guest house, where Nick resided, was smaller, more intimate, yet disconnected, an island of independence within the family compound. Its proximity to the main house would later become more than a detail. It would become critical. In the years leading up to the tragedy, patterns emerged. Arguments that Tracy diffused seemed to resurface later, often with Nick at the center. Financial disputes, disagreements over responsibilities, and the occasional legal threat created an undercurrent of tension. Elaine, the matriarch, tried to maintain balance, often leaning on Tracy for advice. Victor, the patriarch, maintained the outward appearance of authority but privately depended on Tracy to keep the family from fracturing. It's important to note, too, that the Reiner Woods weren't isolated. Their lives were intertwined with Hollywood power networks, social elites, and business relationships that carried their own pressures. They attended charity galas, awards ceremonies, and industry mixers where appearances mattered as much as talent. Maintaining the public image while managing private conflicts became a delicate act. Tracy, in many ways, was the linchpin. She managed schedules, smoothed over misunderstandings, and often absorbed the emotional fallout that could have otherwise erupted in public. But the very skills that made her indispensable also made her a silent witness to the family's darkest moments. She knew more than anyone, perhaps more than she should. Meanwhile, Nick's behavior became increasingly unpredictable. Late-night visits, unexplained absences, and sudden bursts of anger began to alarm family members. Financial irregularities, a charged account here, a mysterious transfer there, raised eyebrows. Tracy observed all of this quietly, taking notes in her mind, compartmentalizing emotions as she always had. But one day, something shifted. The quiet containment she had practiced for decades began to show cracks. A disagreement over a business decision became a public argument in the estate's kitchen. Voices raised, accusations thrown, emotions spilled. Tracy's usual calm veneer faltered, if only momentarily, revealing the intense pressure she had been carrying silently. And Romy? She observed. She watched her older sister's hands tremble just slightly when she picked up the phone. She noted the rigid set of Tracy's jaw, the way her eyes darted toward Nick in that fleeting moment. That observation, seemingly minor, would later become crucial in understanding the events that unfolded. It's here, in these subtle fractures, that the seeds of tragedy were sown. The outward perfection was a mask, and behind it, human flaws, rivalries, and resentments festered. The family members who appeared most composed were often the ones who understood the inner workings the best and could, intentionally or not, manipulate outcomes. Ask yourself this. How many families live behind polished facades, hiding arguments, betrayals, or secrets that, if revealed, could destroy everything? And when disaster strikes, how do those same people respond? Who protects, who exposes, and who profits from the chaos? By the time Sunday night arrived, the night Victor and Elaine were killed, the family had been living in a delicate tension for years. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't spontaneous. The cracks had widened slowly, subtly, unnoticed by neighbors, friends, and the public. But inside, the pressure was building. A small spark could ignite a blaze that no amount of mediation or loyalty could contain. And then the spark came. Sunday arrived like any other, at least on the surface. The Brentwood sun poured through the treetops, brushing the Reinerwood estate in golden light. But sunlight has a way of hiding shadows, and that day, shadows were lurking. Tracy had spent the morning managing schedules, making calls, and coordinating the household. It was routine, the kind of meticulous orchestration that had become her second nature. But even in the comfort of routine, she felt it, a subtle tension, a pulse beneath the calm that suggested something was off. Nick had left the guest house early, ostensibly for a meeting. Romy had stayed in her room, scrolling quietly through social media, detached but alert. Victor and Elaine were tending to weekend errands, discussing renovations, finances, the trivialities that would later feel so painfully ordinary in hindsight. No one could predict how quickly ordinary could dissolve into catastrophe. The first clue that something was wrong came in a small, almost laughable way: the absence of Nick. It was unusual for him to be gone at that hour without checking in. Tracy noticed immediately, but she pushed the feeling aside. Nick was unpredictable, but rarely dangerous, or so she thought. By late afternoon, the tension had thickened. The usual harmony of the estate felt strained. Doors slammed softly, voices carried slightly farther than they should, and Romy mentioned to Tracy that Nick had seemed off in the past few days. The comment was fleeting, casual, almost dismissible, but Tracy's mind registered it. Something in her chest tightened, a premonition she didn't want to acknowledge. Evenings in the Reinerwood house were usually calm. The family would gather in the kitchen for light conversation, discuss the week, sometimes share a drink. That Sunday, however, the calm never arrived. By early evening, the estate was eerily quiet. Tracy checked the guest house, expecting Nick to have returned. Nothing. Her unease escalated. She called him. No answer. Text sent, unanswered. Minutes stretched into hours. Meanwhile, Romy wandered the main house, cleaning up, organizing, anything to distract herself. But she felt the tension growing like an electric current. Something was wrong. She could feel it. The air was heavy, and it wasn't just the summer heat. The first screams, or rather, the absence of sound, heralded the discovery. Romy entered the master bedroom to check on her parents and froze. Victor and Elaine were there, but they weren't moving. Not sleeping. Not resting. Not breathing normally. Their stillness was unnatural, frightening. A quick assessment confirmed what she feared, what she couldn't yet process fully: they were dead. Romy's scream finally pierced the house, a sound raw and desperate. It summoned Tracy, who had been pacing, checking phones, feeling the worst in her gut. She rushed in, her composed facade cracking for the first time in decades. The scene was chaotic, but strangely ordered. Victor and Elaine lay side by side, evidence of a violent struggle evident in the room, but nothing had been stolen. The guest house was empty. No sign of forced entry. Nothing explained the horror unfolding in front of them. Police arrived swiftly. The neighborhood, already alert to the Reinerwood name, watched in disbelief. News cameras began their silent vigil outside the gates, but no one could yet comprehend the magnitude of the crime. Nick became an immediate person of interest. The proximity of the guest house, his absence during the hours leading up to the murders, and a history of emotional volatility made him a prime suspect. Within hours, officers apprehended him, and the first headlines appeared: son arrested in parent murders at $13.5 million Brentwood estate. But even as the focus fell on Nick, something darker loomed in the background. Tracy's role in the events of that night began to raise questions. She had arrived moments after Romy discovered the bodies. She called emergency services, coordinated with authorities, and managed interactions with law enforcement. But her calm, efficient handling, usually praised, now drew scrutiny. How could she remain composed in such a nightmare? Why was she so ready to take control? The initial investigation revealed text messages and phone calls between Tracy and Nick in the days leading up to the murders. The content was ambiguous at first, innocuous in appearance. But investigators noted a pattern. Repeated communication late at night, discussions of financial matters, and cryptic messages about handling things carefully. Tracy's composure was now being reevaluated. What once seemed loyalty and skill could now be interpreted as complicity. Meanwhile, Romy's testimony added fuel to the fire. She revealed her earlier concerns about a dangerous family member. warning authorities that someone close to the family could pose a threat. Though she did not name Tracy explicitly, investigators began to scrutinize the entire family dynamic more closely. Media coverage exploded. Television networks aired segments detailing the Reinerwood tragedy, focusing on the shock factor, the wealth, the celebrity connections, the suddenness of the crime. Viewers were riveted, glued to every development, hungry for the drama that had once seemed distant and untouchable. Amid the chaos, Tracy remained in a paradoxical position. She was both a grieving daughter and a potential suspect. Public opinion was fragmented. Some praised her efficiency, others questioned her motives. Analysts dissected every recorded conversation, every facial expression caught on camera, searching for signs of guilt or innocence. The family estate, once a sanctuary, now resembled a crime scene in both reality and perception. Investigators documented every corner, collected evidence, and pieced together a timeline of events leading to the murders. Tracy's proximity, knowledge, and rapid response made her an unavoidable figure in the narrative. And yet, at the time, even she couldn't predict the storm about to hit. Within days, new details emerged. Financial records suggested unusual transfers. Surveillance footage revealed movements that contradicted initial testimonies. Conversations between siblings, previously assumed trivial, were now scrutinized as possible coordination or conspiracy. The media, relentless as ever, fanned the flames. Headlines hinted at complicity, speculated on motives, and dissected family relationships in excruciating detail. Every nuance of Tracy's behavior was analyzed, every expression interpreted as potential evidence. Ask yourself this. When tragedy strikes, how often do appearances deceive us? When someone steps forward to take control, is it loyalty, self-preservation, or something darker? By the end of that week, the story had shifted from a shocking murder to a tangled web of suspicion, betrayal, and unanswered questions. Tracy, once the unseen stabilizer, had become a figure of intrigue and speculation. The world was watching, and the pieces were moving faster than anyone could keep up. The morning after the arrests, the Reinerwood estate felt like a mausoleum. The sun rose, indifferent, spilling light across the manicured lawns, yet inside, shadows seemed to cling to every corner. The crime scene tape fluttered lightly in the breeze, a stark barrier between the outside world and a reality no one wanted to face. Investigators moved with precision, cataloging every detail. Fingerprints, traces of blood, digital footprints. Each item, no matter how small, was a potential clue, a possible pivot point that could unravel the family's facade. For Tracy, the experience was surreal. She watched, took notes, answered questions, but inside, a storm raged. Every look from an officer, every whispered conversation, felt like a probe into her soul. The first revelation came when investigators reviewed phone records. Nick's communications were expected, but Tracy's were extensive as well. She had been in near constant contact with Nick over the days leading up to the tragedy, often at odd hours, with coded or cryptic messages. What had once seemed like familial support now appeared suspicious. Tracy's role as coordinator became a double-edged sword. The same organizational skills that allowed her to manage family logistics efficiently now framed her as someone who could have orchestrated or at least anticipated the horrors that unfolded. But there was another element, something subtle yet pivotal. Romy, the youngest daughter's testimony had planted a seed in investigators' minds. Her reference to a dangerous family member initially seemed vague, almost speculative. But combined with the communication patterns and Tracy's unusual behavior, it became a focal point. It's crucial to understand the mindset at this stage. Investigators were balancing two realities, the visible facts. Nick's presence in the guest house, the murder scene, and the invisible undercurrents, the family dynamics, loyalties, and hidden tensions. Tracy's proximity and knowledge positioned her uniquely at the intersection of these realities. One evening, an officer pulled Tracy aside to clarify a detail, her movements on the day of the murders. Tracy recounted her timeline precisely, yet each explanation seemed to prompt more questions. Why had she returned to the main house at that particular moment? Why had she handled the calls in such a meticulous, calculated way? Was it instinctive or deliberate? While Tracy maintained composure publicly, private moments told a different story. Her hands trembled slightly when no one was looking. Her eyes would dart toward Romy, searching for reassurance or perhaps for confirmation that the youngest sister had not revealed too much. Every subtle gesture, every quiet hesitation, became a subject of scrutiny. For Romy, the stress manifested differently. She oscillated between shock, fear, and guilt. She replayed the events in her mind endlessly, searching for clues she might have missed. Each time she did, the image of Tracy shifted slightly, sometimes protector, sometimes suspect, sometimes enigma. Meanwhile, Nick's trial preparations moved forward. Evidence collection was intense, with digital and forensic teams analyzing data points that could take months to unravel. Investigators sought patterns, connections, anything that could indicate motive or collaboration. And through it all, Tracy remained central, not as a defendant yet, but as a critical figure whose actions could influence the case profoundly. The media began to shape public perception even before charges were fully determined. Pundits speculated about hidden family tensions, past grievances, and possible conspiracies. Every minor inconsistency in Tracy's statements became fodder for debate. Public opinion swayed back and forth, one day portraying her as a grieving daughter, the next as someone with hidden complicity. And then came the financial discoveries. Unusual transfers, sudden withdrawals, and unexplained accounts emerged during forensic audits. Investigators could not yet connect these directly to the murders, but the implications were undeniable. A narrative began to form. Perhaps someone had motive beyond emotion, greed, inheritance, or control over the family estate. Tracy's meticulous nature, once lauded, now became suspicious. Investigators began to question whether her organizational skills had been a tool for coordination or manipulation. Could she have orchestrated events to protect Nick? Or worse, to benefit herself? The psychological dimension was equally compelling. Experts brought in to evaluate the family dynamics highlighted patterns of loyalty, control, and emotional dependency. Tracy had always been the anchor, but anchors can be double-edged. They stabilize the ship, yes, but they can also determine the direction of the vessel entirely. As days passed, Romy's statements grew more detailed. She recounted late-night arguments she had overheard, fleeting gestures between Tracy and Nick, moments that seemed inconsequential at the time but now appeared loaded with meaning. Investigators began mapping these interactions, creating timelines and behavioral analyses that would later play a crucial role in the courtroom. Tracy's emotional state became a subject of scrutiny as well. Observers noted subtle signs of stress, but she remained outwardly composed. In interviews, she spoke with clarity and precision, carefully choosing words that neither incriminated nor exonerated herself. Yet behind her calm exterior, the pressure was building. And then, a new development shook the investigation to its core. A witness came forward. Someone who had seen Tracy and Nick together in the days leading up to the murders, acting in ways that raised questions about coordination and planning. The testimony was circumstantial but alarming, reinforcing suspicions that Tracy's role was far from passive. Ask yourself this: when a family's outer harmony is shattered, how quickly do loyalties shift? Who remains trustworthy, and who becomes a potential threat? And when a trusted figure suddenly appears central to a criminal investigation, what does that reveal about the delicate web of relationships that once seemed unbreakable? Families are often described as havens, places of safety, trust, and unconditional love. But sometimes, the very intimacy that binds family members can conceal the deepest secrets. In the Reiner household, what appeared as unity and stability was, in truth, a labyrinth of hidden resentments, unspoken grievances, and silent power struggles. Tracy had spent decades mastering the art of family diplomacy. She knew how to smooth over disagreements, redirect conversations before they escalated, and compartmentalize emotions so efficiently that outsiders rarely detected tension. To the public, she was the embodiment of grace under pressure. To the family, she was indispensable. And yet, those same skills now cast shadows of suspicion. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered layers of history that painted a far more complex picture than the facade presented in family photos. Old disputes over inheritance resurfaced, disputes that had never been resolved but had simmered quietly beneath polite smiles and polite nods. Discussions that had once seemed trivial. Who would inherit a vintage film collection? Who would manage philanthropic endeavors? Even minor disagreements over property lines were suddenly reframed as pieces of a puzzle that could explain motive, opportunity, or both. Romy, young and observant, began recalling conversations and moments that, at the time, had seemed insignificant. A whispered argument overheard late at night. A subtle gesture from Tracy toward Nick that suggested alignment rather than mediation. Small incidents, innocent in isolation, now formed patterns that investigators were eager to examine. One of the most compelling discoveries came in the form of financial anomalies. Tracy had access to the family's accounts and often handled transfers and payments, ostensibly for household management. But auditors noticed irregular withdrawals, transfers between accounts that were difficult to explain, and payments to entities that were obscure, yet connected to Nick in unclear ways. These findings raised critical questions. Was she simply managing complex family finances, or had she been maneuvering resources in anticipation of events yet to unfold? Psychologists later described Tracy's behavior during the early investigation as a textbook example of controlled panic. She maintained outward composure, spoke clearly to investigators, and provided detailed accounts of her movements. Yet microexpressions, subtle gestures, and fleeting inconsistencies suggested internal turmoil, an emotional tension that had not been visible in her public life. The dynamic between the siblings also came under intense scrutiny. Romy's perception of Tracy shifted rapidly as the investigation progressed. She began to wonder whether her sister's composure had been a mask for something more calculated. Was Tracy merely loyal, or was she orchestrating events from behind the scenes? Romy's earlier warning about a dangerous family member now seemed more pointed in retrospect. Investigators examined communication records in detail. Text messages between Tracy and Nick, once considered benign, now appeared coded. There were conversations about handling things carefully, keeping appearances, and making sure no one notices. Investigators could not immediately interpret these as criminal intent, but in context with other evidence, the messages suggested a level of awareness or complicity that could not be ignored. The household itself revealed symbolic clues. The estate's layout, with the main house and the guest house, created physical separation between family members, but it also facilitated surveillance, observation, and subtle manipulation. Nick's independence in the guest house allowed him freedom of movement, while Tracy's central position in the main house offered both proximity and oversight. The architecture, almost unknowingly, mirrored the power dynamics and potential for control within the family. Beyond physical and financial clues, investigators began to analyze behavioral patterns. Tracy's interactions were meticulous, her attention to detail extraordinary. She could anticipate the questions of investigators, preemptively provide documents, and manage narratives with precision. But that same skill set, when examined critically, suggested a capability for orchestration rather than mere assistance. The media amplified every discovery, feeding the public's appetite for intrigue. Headlines highlighted the composed sister juxtaposed with the troubled son, painting a dramatic tableau of betrayal, loyalty, and hidden agendas. Analysts speculated endlessly. Had Tracy facilitated, covered up, or even manipulated events leading to the murders? Every statement she made was dissected, every photograph scrutinized for microexpressions that might betray her thoughts. Romy's perspective remained crucial. She described moments in the days before the tragedy that hinted at shifting alliances. Whispered discussions, fleeting glances, and unusual behavior all became pieces in a mosaic that suggested deeper conflicts. She noticed things that adults often overlooked: the tension in Tracy's voice, the way she seemed to steer conversations toward certain topics, the subtle guidance of Nick's actions. It's important to recognize the psychological stakes at this point. Tracy, aware that the investigation was intensifying, had to navigate dual realities, outwardly grieving and cooperating with authorities while internally managing fear, guilt, or possibly calculation. Each interaction, each decision, could alter perceptions, impact legal outcomes, or change the trajectory of public opinion. One of the more chilling aspects was how seamlessly the family's ordinary routines intersected with extraordinary tension. Tasks that appeared mundane, managing appointments, sending emails, arranging household finances, became instruments of observation and influence. Tracy's mastery of these routines blurred the line between caretaker and orchestrator, making the distinction nearly impossible for investigators and public observers alike. And as the week progressed, new forensic evidence began to emerge. Subtle inconsistencies in timelines, the precise timing of phone calls, and even traces of DNA in unexpected places complicated the narrative. While none of it conclusively implicated Tracy, it painted a picture of interconnected movements, communications, and decision-making that could not be ignored. Ask yourself this: when a family's veneer of perfection masks hidden rivalries and silent manipulation, how quickly can loyalty transform into complicity? How often do the people we trust the most hold the power to shape events in ways we cannot perceive? By the end of this chapter, one undeniable truth had become clear. The Reiner family's tragedy was no longer a story of a single act of violence. It had become a complex web of secrets, behavior, and relationships, with Tracy Reiner at the center of both scrutiny and speculation. The Reiner estate, once a symbol of elegance and control, now seemed to exhale tension. Every corridor, every staircase, and every meticulously curated room held a memory, a secret, or a question that investigators and media alike wanted answered. Tracy had always been the family's stabilizer, the calm in the storm, but in the wake of tragedy, that calm began to look more like calculation than composure. It's easy to look at a family and assume cohesion, especially when they present a polished exterior to the world. But cohesion is not always stability. In the Reiner case, cohesion was often enforced, maintained through subtle power plays, careful monitoring of behavior, and the silent threat of disapproval. For Tracy, this had been second nature for decades. Every word, every gesture, every action could either maintain harmony or spark conflict, and she had perfected the art of preventing the latter. Yet perfection has limits. Investigators began reconstructing the hours before the murders. Surveillance footage, timestamps on digital devices, and eyewitness accounts created a timeline that left very little room for ambiguity. Each moment, each movement, was analyzed. Tracy's activities, which once seemed routine, making calls, checking in on the household, coordinating schedules, were now scrutinized as potential pieces of a puzzle. Friends and acquaintances began to speak. Some defended her, citing years of loyalty and grace under pressure. Others questioned how someone so composed could remain so efficient in a moment of pure chaos. The duality of Tracy's persona fascinated psychologists brought in to evaluate behavior. Outwardly empathetic, inwardly meticulous, capable of both deep care and strategic thinking. Could these traits coexist with complicity, or were they merely misunderstood in the context of grief and shock? Meanwhile, Romy's role as an observer became more prominent. She recalled moments she had initially dismissed, Nick and Tracy whispering late at night, financial discussions that seemed unnecessary, and Tracy subtly guiding conversations to avoid exposure. Romy's perception of her sister shifted as she pieced together these moments, realizing that the woman she had admired for her strength and wisdom might not be as transparent as she appeared. The media narrative amplified the tension. Headlines painted the Reiner as a family torn apart not just by tragedy, but by internal secrets and possible betrayal. Analysts speculated endlessly about motives, alliances, and hidden agendas. Tracy's image, once untouchable, was now a subject of relentless scrutiny. Every public statement, every photograph, every nuance of body language became evidence in the court of public opinion. Investigators began to notice discrepancies in Tracy's accounts of her movements. Minor contradictions in timelines, small omissions, and unexplained absences raised red flags. While none were conclusive, when layered over communication records and behavioral observations, they suggested a complexity to her actions that demanded further exploration. The estate itself held symbolic significance. Rooms that had once been spaces of comfort now seemed like stages where subtle power dynamics played out. The main house, commanding and imposing, represented authority. The guest house, where Nick resided, allowed for independence but also created opportunities for secretive interactions. Tracy's oversight of the main house positioned her in a unique place of influence, able to observe, guide, or even manipulate events from a central vantage point. Psychologists analyzing the case noted the pattern of behavior common in families with intense internal hierarchies. The oldest sibling or central figure often exerts influence not through overt power, but through subtle, calculated actions, steering decisions, influencing perceptions, and sometimes, without conscious intent, guiding outcomes in ways that others cannot predict. Tracy fit this profile in alarming ways. New evidence emerged that further complicated the narrative. Financial audits revealed transfers that coincided with key dates leading up to the tragedy. Text messages, initially dismissed as routine family communication, contained phrases that could be interpreted as strategic guidance or warnings. Every layer of investigation deepened the complexity, making it increasingly difficult to separate intention from circumstance. And then there were the psychological undercurrents, the emotions that no evidence could fully capture. Grief, fear, loyalty, resentment, and suppressed anger all collided in ways that created unpredictable behaviors. Tracy, trained to manage these forces in others, now faced them within herself. Could someone so skilled at control truly be neutral in a situation of escalating danger, or had her instincts for management shifted into something more deliberate? Ask yourself this. When someone has spent a lifetime managing tension and directing outcomes, how easy is it for them to cross the line, intentionally or not, without realizing it? And when the consequences are fatal, does intent even matter? As investigators prepared to broaden their scope, the Reinerwood family's secrets began to emerge in fragments, whispered arguments, financial maneuvers, subtle manipulations. Tracy's role, once assumed to be protective, now hovered ambiguously between guardian and orchestrator. The night of the murders was no longer an isolated event. It became a culmination of years of behavior, choices, and relationships that had quietly fractured. And while Nick remained the immediate focus of legal action, Tracy's proximity, knowledge, and control of family dynamics made her a figure of intrigue, suspicion, and unavoidable consequence. By the end of this chapter, the chilling realization became clear. The family's tragedy was not just a story of a violent night. It was the exposure of a carefully maintained facade, the unraveling of hidden tensions, and the revelation that the very skills that kept a family together could also make them vulnerable to unimaginable betrayal. The courthouse buzzed with tension the morning Tracy was called to testify. Outside, media vans lined the streets, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, transmitting live updates to millions glued to screens. Inside, the air was thick, a blend of anxiety, anticipation, and the unspoken understanding that every word spoken could shift the trajectory of the entire case. Tracy entered the courtroom with a steady gait, her posture straight, her face composed. But beneath the veneer of calm, a storm raged. She had spent decades controlling situations, managing family crises, and ensuring the Reinerwood name remained untarnished. Now, control was slipping through her fingers, replaced by the uncomfortable reality that her actions, her presence, and her very persona were under microscopic scrutiny. The prosecutor began methodically, framing the timeline of events leading up to the murders. Evidence was presented piece by piece. Phone records, surveillance footage, financial transfers, witness testimonies. Each piece built a narrative, suggesting a level of planning, coordination, and possible complicity that reached far beyond Nick's initial involvement. Tracy listened intently. Every piece of evidence felt like a mirror reflecting her own life back at her, but distorted, interpreted through suspicion and assumption. The courtroom, filled with jurors, attorneys, and onlookers, became an arena where personal history, familial loyalty, and legal accountability collided. Cross-examination was relentless. Questions were designed to probe every detail of her involvement, her knowledge of Nick's whereabouts, the content of her communications, her actions in the hours immediately following the murders. Each answer required precision, every hesitation noted. For the first time, Tracy felt the weight of public and legal expectation bearing down in a tangible way. Observers couldn't help but notice her composure. Her voice remained steady, measured. She navigated the complex web of questions with remarkable clarity, revealing enough to demonstrate honesty while withholding unnecessary admissions. Yet, even small expressions, a tightened jaw, a subtle blink, a brief pause, were captured by cameras, analyzed for signs of guilt or deceit. The prosecution introduced witness testimonies that were particularly challenging for Tracy. Romy, torn between loyalty and fear, recounted moments leading up to the murders that suggested premeditated awareness. Her words, though careful, hinted at coordination and subtle influence. The courtroom held its breath as the youngest sister detailed what she had observed: gestures, conversations, behaviors that previously seemed inconsequential but now painted a troubling picture. One pivotal moment involved a series of late-night texts between Tracy and Nick. Messages about handling things delicately and ensuring no mistakes were presented as evidence. Tracy's defense argued these were typical family communications, concerned with household management and protection. The prosecution framed them as coded instructions, possibly guiding Nick in ways that implicated Tracy. The media coverage outside intensified, broadcasting every exchange, dissecting facial expressions, and speculating on motives. Social media exploded with theories. Had Tracy manipulated events to protect her brother, or was she complicit in a more sinister way? Public opinion swayed like a pendulum, sometimes sympathetic, sometimes accusatory, reflecting the uncertainty that permeated the legal proceedings. Psychologists brought in by the defense and prosecution offered conflicting interpretations of Tracy's behavior. Defense experts emphasized her history as a stabilizer, a mediator, and a responsible family member who acted out of care and loyalty. Prosecution experts highlighted patterns of meticulous control, subtle manipulation, and strategic thinking that could be interpreted as intentional orchestration. Amid the courtroom drama, Tracy maintained a delicate balance. She navigated grief, suspicion, and legal strategy simultaneously, a task that required extraordinary focus. Every interaction, every response, carried potential consequences. The line between truth and perception blurred, leaving observers, both in court and at home, grappling with the complexity of human behavior in extreme circumstances. Meanwhile, Nick's case unfolded in parallel, his guilt in the murders established through direct evidence. But Tracy's proximity, knowledge, and actions remained under scrutiny. The narrative evolved from a single act of violence to a story of intertwined behaviors, familial loyalty, and moral ambiguity. The tension reached a crescendo when the judge allowed the presentation of financial documents that implicated Tracy indirectly. Transfers coinciding with critical dates, seemingly minor expenditures, and patterns of communication suggested a level of foreknowledge or participation. Tracy's face remained calm, but inside, every heartbeat echoed like a drum, reminding her that the courtroom's eyes were relentless. Ask yourself this: when someone is placed under intense scrutiny, how much does perception shape reality? Can competence be mistaken for complicity, loyalty for orchestration, or control for manipulation? And when millions are watching, how easily can the truth become a story shaped by interpretation rather than fact? By the end of the day, one thing was clear. The courtroom drama was far from over. Tracy's composure, intelligence, and history of familial oversight had made her a figure of fascination, suspicion, and intrigue. The stage was set for revelations that would shock not only the jury but the public who had followed the Reinerwood story from the beginning. As the trial progressed, the Reinerwood family's public image began to fracture, revealing the hidden tensions that had long simmered beneath the surface. For years, the household had operated like a carefully choreographed performance. Smiles, polite conversation, and controlled gestures masked a deeper reality: rivalries, resentment, and unspoken grievances that only those living within the walls could fully understand. Tracy had always been the unseen conductor of this performance. She managed schedules, smoothed over disputes, and anticipated conflicts before they escalated. Friends and acquaintances often described her as the backbone of the family, the one person capable of maintaining order when emotions ran high. But the very skills that earned her praise also positioned her in a place of extraordinary influence, an influence investigators now scrutinized closely. Inside the courtroom, the layers of family tension became more visible. Witnesses described arguments previously dismissed as minor or trivial. Disagreements over inheritance, conflicting visions for the family estate, and subtle power struggles that had been normalized over decades. Each anecdote revealed that the Reinerwoods' cohesion was maintained through careful manipulation and management, not through inherent harmony. Romy's testimony became increasingly pivotal. She recounted interactions that suggested more than ordinary sibling communication. Late-night phone calls, whispered conversations, and small gestures between Tracy and Nick hinted at alignment and coordination. While Romy emphasized that she had no concrete proof of wrongdoing, the pattern of observations raised serious questions for investigators. Meanwhile, forensic evidence continued to emerge. Analysis of the crime scene revealed subtle indicators that challenged initial assumptions. Items in the main house were slightly disturbed. Movements through the estate suggested awareness of the layout, and timestamps of certain actions raised questions about the sequence of events. Each piece of information, when combined, painted a complex picture that investigators struggled to interpret fully. Financial scrutiny added another layer of tension. Tracy's access to the family's accounts had always been a practical necessity, but forensic accountants identified transfers that coincided with key moments before the murders. While the amounts were not large enough to constitute theft, their timing and recipients drew attention. Investigators began asking whether these actions were protective measures, preemptive maneuvers, or signs of something more deliberate. The media, of course, amplified every revelation. Headlines shifted from reporting the murders to analyzing the family dynamics. Commentators debated the implications of Tracy's behavior, the significance of her communications with Nick, and the moral responsibilities of family members in crises. Public perception became a battleground, with narratives of loyalty, betrayal, and complicity competing for attention. Within the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Every witness, every piece of evidence, every line of questioning chipped away at the carefully maintained image of the Reinerwoods as a harmonious family. Tracy, while composed outwardly, felt the pressure intensely. Her ability to control situations and manage perceptions was being tested like never before. Psychologists weighing in on the case highlighted a critical dynamic: the interplay between control and influence. Tracy's history of managing family affairs, directing interactions, and mitigating conflict could be interpreted in multiple ways. Was she acting out of instinctive loyalty, or had her role evolved into subtle orchestration of events? The line between competence and complicity was blurred, leaving both investigators and the public to speculate. The trial also exposed contradictions in previous statements. Minor inconsistencies in Tracy's recounting of events became focal points for cross-examination. Defense attorneys emphasized her grief and stress, portraying these discrepancies as natural under trauma. Prosecutors, however, framed them as evidence of careful calculation, strategic omission, or premeditated guidance. The courtroom became a stage where perception often mattered as much as fact. Even within the family, relationships were strained. Romy's observations created tension between sisters. Private conversations revealed the subtle ways loyalty, fear, and uncertainty intersected. Tracy's role as mediator was no longer uncontested. Suspicion had crept into the family unit, and even long-standing trust was challenged. Ask yourself this: when long-standing familial hierarchies are disrupted by tragedy, how easily can perception become reality? When loyalty intersects with opportunity, and influence meets circumstance, how do we determine intent? And when the stakes involve life, death, and legacy, who can truly claim neutrality? By the end of this chapter, one fact became undeniable. The Reinerwood family was not a simple story of crime and consequence. It was a complex tapestry of hidden tensions, strategic behavior, and ambiguous loyalties. Tracy, the once invisible stabilizer, now stood at the center of attention, caught between her public image, her private actions, and the relentless scrutiny of both legal authorities and a captivated public. The trial entered a critical phase, one that would forever alter the perception of Tracy Reiner's role in the tragedy. Evidence, once fragmented and circumstantial, began to coalesce into a narrative that demanded careful scrutiny. Each detail, each record, each testimony added weight to the question: had Tracy been merely a sister caught in a nightmare, or had she played a more active, deliberate role? Investigators focused on communication records first. Tracy's phone activity was dissected with surgical precision. Texts, emails, and call logs spanning the weeks leading up to the murders were analyzed not just for content, but for timing, frequency, and pattern. Messages previously dismissed as routine coordination began to take on new significance. References to handling things carefully and making sure no one notices were examined line by line, scrutinized for hidden meaning. While defenders argued these were familial logistics, prosecutors suggested they were evidence of premeditated influence, possibly even orchestration. Financial evidence added another layer of complexity. Transfers between accounts, sudden withdrawals, and payments to obscure entities aligned with key dates, raising questions about motive and foreknowledge. Were these legitimate transactions necessary for household management, or had Tracy leveraged her control over finances to subtly manipulate circumstances? The forensic accounting team presented data showing repeated patterns, timing, and recipients that made casual explanation increasingly difficult. Physical evidence from the estate further complicated matters. Investigators meticulously reconstructed the crime scene, noting the positions of Victor and Elaine, disturbances in various rooms, and the flow of movement within the house. Items slightly out of place, doors left ajar, and overlooked footprints all became points of analysis. While none conclusively implicated Tracy, when combined with her knowledge of the house layout and routines, they suggested she had the means to influence outcomes or monitor events without detection. Then came eyewitness testimony. Family, friends, and acquaintances described subtle behavioral patterns. Some noted that Tracy had been unusually focused on Nick's activities in the days preceding the tragedy. Others highlighted minor interactions, gestures, and comments that had previously seemed innocuous but, in context, now suggested a level of awareness and possible guidance. Romy's accounts were particularly striking, as she detailed moments where Tracy appeared to steer or influence Nick in ways that could have impacted his decisions. Media coverage turned these revelations into a spectacle. Analysts dissected behavior, questioned motives, and debated the likelihood of complicity. Headlines alternated between portraying Tracy as a composed, loyal daughter and a shadowy figure possibly shaping events behind the scenes. Public opinion shifted with each new piece of evidence, creating a maelstrom of speculation, judgment, and intrigue. In court, cross-examination became a psychological battlefield. Prosecutors carefully juxtaposed statements, timelines, and communications to suggest coherence between Tracy's actions and potential complicity. Defense attorneys emphasized stress, grief, and instinctive family protection, arguing that what appeared as coordination could simply be crisis management. Every question, every pause, every expression was captured and scrutinized. Tracy, while outwardly composed, felt the invisible weight of judgment pressing in from all directions. Experts were brought in to interpret behavior. Psychologists analyzed Tracy's past interactions, noting patterns of control, influence, and management. Defense experts highlighted her history as a mediator, someone trained to anticipate conflict and intervene. Prosecution experts argued that the same traits, in the context of tragedy, could suggest manipulation and forethought. The debate blurred lines between intent and circumstance, creating ambiguity that fascinated the courtroom and the public alike. Even within the family, dynamics shifted under scrutiny. Romy's observations, once casual, were now pivotal evidence. Subtle tensions between sisters emerged as private conversations revealed suspicion, fear, and a re-evaluation of long-standing assumptions. Trust, previously taken for granted, became fragile. Ask yourself this: when evidence is layered, complex, and open to interpretation, how do we separate intention from coincidence? When actions can be read in multiple ways, who decides which interpretation prevails? And in a case where family bonds, loyalty, and tragedy intersect, Can objective truth ever fully emerge? By the end of this chapter, one reality became undeniable. Tracy Reiner was no longer a background figure. Every action, every decision, every expression had been magnified, dissected, and interpreted. The narrative had shifted from a singular act of violence to a complex story of influence, knowledge, and potentially hidden orchestration. The trial had reached a stage where every subtle detail could tip the scales. The courtroom was packed, tension humming in the air like electricity. Tracy Reiner sat poised, her posture immaculate, yet behind the calm exterior, a torrent of emotion threatened to surface. Every eye was on her, every camera focused, every whisper amplified. The world was watching, and so was Nick, sitting just a few rows away, his expression unreadable but tense. The turning point came with a piece of evidence that neither the defense nor the prosecution could ignore: security footage from the night of the murders. At first glance, the video seemed mundane, shadows moving through hallways, doors opening and closing. But forensic analysts highlighted moments previously overlooked: Tracy's movements within the house, her positioning relative to Nick, and subtle gestures that suggested awareness and foresight. The prosecution presented the footage methodically, drawing attention to timing, proximity, and behavior. Each frame was dissected: the way Tracy paused before entering certain rooms, her interactions with objects, and her responses to unseen events. Prosecutors asked pointed questions. Did she know more than she admitted? Was she monitoring Nick's actions, facilitating events, or merely responding instinctively to unfolding chaos? The courtroom hung on every word. Defense attorneys countered with context. They emphasized Tracy's history of meticulous household management, her instinctive reaction to emergencies, and her role as the family mediator. They argued that any apparent foresight was nothing more than routine vigilance, a natural response to the unpredictable behaviors of her brother. Every motion, they claimed, was protective, not manipulative. But witnesses complicated the narrative further. Romy, visibly emotional, testified again, detailing interactions she had witnessed in the days and weeks leading up to the tragedy. She recalled conversations where Tracy appeared to guide Nick subtly, to encourage restraint, or to manage situations carefully. While Romy insisted her sister had no intent to harm, her observations suggested a level of influence that could not be ignored. Financial evidence added fuel to the fire. Detailed analyses of account transfers and expenditures